Thank you, Jay, for inviting me to Christiania. It's amazing. And that was the most fantastic introduction I've ever had. Okay, we're living at a really exciting time now for cannabis research and for cannabis politics. Tonight I'm going to talk about these three key aspects: pleasure, madness, and medicine. I'm going to start with a very brief history, and I'm going to talk about how does cannabis affect your madness stroke mental health. And a lot of research we've been doing over the last 10 years has been looking at different kinds of cannabis. Cannabis is not one thing, it's a very complex plant. And how different types of cannabis have different psychological effects. And there's also been a lot of understanding that's happened, new research showing what happens in the brain and in the periphery, in the body. And we'll be looking at why we all have cannabis receptors, whether or not we smoke cannabis. One of the most exciting, very new developments has been pulling apart of the cannabis plant to see if we can create important medicines for important disorders. So I'll go on to that. And then I'll end by asking, and that would be kind of great to have some debate, about how scientific understanding can contribute to debates about legalization. And it's fantastic being here in Christiania to give this talk. Okay, probably as you know, the medical use of cannabis goes back at least 2,000 years. It was used especially for pain. Is this microphone working all right? Yeah. Okay. It was used especially for pain, probably first in China, 2,800 years BC, but also very widely in India. There's lots of evidence going back about the use of cannabis. And apart from the medical use, there's early evidence of its religious and spiritual use. So on the left there, we're talking about ancient Egypt. It's got a rather nice cannabis plant depicted above the man's head, who's also got a joint in his hand. You see? Very interesting. And it is used spiritually and religiously in many different countries still. And there's even a possibility that it's used in the Western world to help religion. Even today. Europe, the Western world, America, Australia, were a bit slower than India and China to catch on to the medical advantages of this plant. But in my own country, in the UK, Queen Victoria used to take cannabis all the time in a form of resin from her doctor because it helped her period pains and it also helped her during childbirth. So it says something about the English royal family. But cannabis and pleasure, I think most people here don't need convincing. But I did happen to find on the web this picture of the Christiania football team who were warming up before one of their matches. And how amazing to combine two great pleasures in life. But most of the research, the scientific research done on cannabis, at least until recent years, has not been about its pleasure, how it brings about pleasure, and it's not been about medicine until very recently. Most of the research followed very much in the political trail of Richard Nixon's war on drugs, and it looked particularly for negative effects of the drug. And the main research I want to talk about for the first half of this talk is how the three major harms of cannabis have received a lot of scientific attention. So there are physical effects of the drug, often mostly to do with it being smoked, but we're not going to talk about those. In terms of mental health or madness, three main focuses of research. 1, psychosis, 2, addiction, and 3, memory impairment. Now, what do we know about this already? Well, psychosis, we know that long-term cannabis use, there have been studies in New Zealand and in Sweden showing that long-term cannabis use increases your risk of psychosis by about 40%. Psychosis is the breakdown in the connection between what you're feeling, what you're thinking, and how you're behaving. And a major psychotic disorder is schizophrenia. Heavy use increases your risk by 200%, it doubles it. And we know that a single dose of cannabis, or its active ingredient THC, induces psychosis-like effects, especially if you inject the THC in you or I, healthy people. Memory impairment is a well-known effect of this drug. Cannabis, again, or its active ingredient THC, produces very strong dose-related impairments of your memory. So the more you take, the worse your memory becomes. And we know why this happens, because there's an area of your brain in blue there called the hippocampus, which is the main way you acquire new information before it then gets spread out onto the cortex. And this blue area is stuffed full of cannabis receptors, and that's why cannabis acts there to make you forget. And we know particularly it's the mechanism of this is it disrupts a form of plasticity in the brain that underlies your brain has to change when you remember something. So it's a plastic effect, and cannabis disrupts that. But in terms of the long-term effects on memory, the findings are really inconsistent. There's nothing you can say for sure at the moment. And addiction's a really interesting aspect of cannabis, because years ago, when I was at university, when there were still dinosaurs around, cannabis addiction wasn't a problem. You never heard of it. People used cannabis, then often they used it less as they left university. But you didn't come across cannabis addicts. You came across people addicted to alcohol and other things, cocaine, other drugs. But cannabis addiction wasn't known at that time. But in the last 10 years, it's become a real problem, which is interesting. Why on earth that's happened? What's changed? That's what we'll be talking about. So there are about 180 million people using cannabis around the world. And now it's about 1 in 10, 1 in 9, 11%, that's 20 million people have developed cannabis dependence. They've become addicted to the drug. Recent survey in Europe has shown that 1% of all adults, not just cannabis smokers, and nearly 2% of 14 to 17-year-olds are addicted to the drug. The reason for new referrals of people into addiction services is now cannabis in 28% of cases throughout Europe, which is second only to heroin at 41%. This is a very new world of cannabis addiction. But at the same time, if you think about it, certainly in the UK, half of kids between 16 and 24 will have at least tried it, and a lot of them would smoke quite often, especially at weekends. So in a way, cannabis use is almost the norm among lots of young people. And it's certainly the case that they will all experience memory impairment after they've smoked a spliff, that maybe 11% will become addicted. A very tiny, tiny percentage, not below 1%, will develop any form of psychosis. So the real fact is that most people can smoke cannabis without experiencing any negative mental health effects at all. In fact, people have smoked cannabis and gone on to have quite successful lives. So Queen Victoria has reigned longer than any other monarch in the UK, despite her cannabis habit. And Barack Obama, he now says, as a kid, I smoked pot. And he said only this January, he finally came out and said, I don't think cannabis is more dangerous than alcohol. I think most scientists would agree with him. So why is it that some people are becoming addicted, some people are having problems, and an awful lot of people are not? What determines whether an individual is vulnerable to the harmful effects of cannabis? Well, we already know some things about this. We know that the risks go up the more you use. So if you're, a 16-year-old waking up in the morning, smoking your first spliff before breakfast and going on the rest of the day, then you're using very heavily, you're going to be subject to harms. The age of first cannabis use, the evidence is that if you start using cannabis, say between 10 and 14 years of age, that's really going to increase your risks of harm. Because during adolescence, that time period, puberty, when your body's undergoing lots of changes, so is your brain. Your brain has many, many important changes in adolescence. And if you smoke a drug that's acting on important areas like the hippocampus, that's not going to be a good idea. So young age is a risk. Psychosis proneness, even though we're schizophrenic, there's a continuum from people being completely normal to people being schizophrenic. And you and I vary along that continuum. You can measure it. And the higher you are, the more your risk. So if you are a vulnerable child or adolescent for other reasons, perhaps you have a schizophrenic in your family, perhaps you started smoking cannabis very young, then it's well documented now that smoking cannabis at that young age can make you develop schizophrenia 2 to 3 years younger than if you didn't smoke cannabis at all. And that's a bad thing for the brain, because the earlier you get the earlier you get schizophrenia, the worse your outcome in later life. And there are also some genetic factors involved. But I was kind of intrigued to see why addiction has only become a problem more recently. And thinking about it, one of the things that struck me and my group of researchers was, what about the type of cannabis used? Because we know the thing that's changed in the last 10 years is the type of cannabis, and maybe that's what's causing these new problems. So I asked a Danish psychiatrist friend in London, just asked him what types of cannabis are around in Denmark, and he sent me this list. And I was amazed, because it seems like Danish people have more words for cannabis than Eskimos have for snow. And I was particularly amazed because he translated some of them for me. And he said, the first one, I think you say feth, yeah. Why is that cannabis? And this one was really intriguing. Where does that one come from? She said it means the feces of a camel. Is that true? A camel turd. Okay. Yeah, same thing. Anyway, so there are lots and lots of different Danish words for cannabis. But do they mean anything? Well, actually, they probably do. Because cannabis isn't one thing. Cannabis has got over 100 unique ingredients in the plant that you get nowhere else, only in the cannabis plant. So it's an extraordinary plant. So these 100 different cannabinoids, we call them, are what makes up cannabis. And perhaps feth and camel turd or whatever have different proportions of these different 100 cannabinoids. Now, tonight I'm going to talk about the two main ones. The two most, in different kinds of cannabis, the two most prominent are THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which, as you know, that's what makes people stoned. That's why people smoke cannabis or eat it or whatever. It's for its THC content. Now, there's another cannabinoid that's present in some forms of cannabis, but not others over the last 10 years, which is called cannabidiol, or CBD. And this is a very, very interesting compound. So most balanced cannabis should have both these compounds and 98 others. But that's not the case anymore. If you give THC in a laboratory to a person, so the pure extract, it makes people very anxious, and even healthy people will show some psychotic symptoms. So they'll have some sort of delusions, hallucinations, in a very mild form, nothing like full schizophrenia. If you give them CBD, cannabidiol, you get the opposite effect. Cannabidiol reduces people's anxiety, makes them relax. And it may, and I'll show you some evidence a bit later, it may also reduce psychotic symptoms. And if you look at the pharmacology, if you look at receptors in the brain, THC and CBD have opposite effects on these receptors in the brain. So in a way, I don't know if you can see this, they're almost a kind of yin and yang of the cannabis plant. They seem to do the opposite things to each other. So we thought this was very interesting. If they are opposite, then perhaps CBD can protect people using cannabis against the harmful toxic effects of THC. Now, I actually do research with lots of other drugs, psychiatric drugs as well. And if someone asks me a question like, what effect does cannabis with CBD have on people compared with cannabis with no CBD, what I do is randomize people, a third given cannabis with CBD, a third given cannabis with no CBD in it, and 33% given placebo cannabis, which you can now get very convincing stuff from the Netherlands. It's the only convincing cannabis placebo I've ever seen. So that would be a normal scientist approach to looking at this question. Okay? You can't do it. You can't do it because it's illegal. I can give people 1 dose, 2 doses maybe. I can't do a proper clinical trial because it's an illegal drug. Your brain doesn't know the difference between legal and illegal, but the government tells you can't do this research because it's illegal. So you have to think of more creative ways of trying to answer those questions without breaking the law. So the way we decided to do it was through hair. Yeah, sounds odd. Your hair is an amazing thing because in the shaft of the hair, here, the hair keeps a record of your diet, what kind of foods you've been eating, but also what drugs you've been using, okay? And it's such a good measure of drugs is that you can take hair, I can take your hair, yeah, and I can look at it and see what kind of cannabis you've been smoking. Yeah, so I can see if your cannabis has got CBD in it or just THC. Now, hair grows about 1 centimetre every month. So this Danish clown, I think, has about 5 centimetres. So we could work out what kind of cannabis he'd been smoking for about 5 months. Yeah, whereas down here, Lady Gaga, we could go to 3 years to actually follow her drug history. So this was one way that we could have a look at what was going on with people's use of THC and CBD in cannabis. So in a very early experiment, we just took about 150 young people who'd been involved in our research, and we took samples of hair and got it analysed for CBD and THC. And we also used a standard measure of psychotic-like symptoms, which is called the O-Life. And we compared them. And we found that in 20 of these young people, their hair only contained THC. There was no CBD. So that showed what sort of cannabis they'd been using. 26 of them had both THC and CBD in their hair. Most people had either. And this odd group, who might have been to the States where you can get this stuff, there was only 8 of them, so we couldn't do any stats analysis on it. So when we compared the groups with THC, with both, and with neither, what we found here is that unusual experiences, which is an index of delusions and hallucinations, so a psychotic-like symptom, was different. And it was the people who had THC only in their hair who were scoring significantly higher on psychotic experiences. So basically, if you had no THC or CBD in your hair, you were fine. If you had THC only in your hair, you were high in delusions and hallucinations. But extraordinarily, if you had both, so this goes to our yin-yang hypothesis, if you had both, you were just the same as the people with none. Okay? So it was the THC-only group who had the problems. So this suggested that CBD protects you against the harmful effects of THC. So then we went on to do a bigger study with a naturalistic study with young cannabis users, 16 to 23-year-olds, and we got them to smoke their own cannabis, and they, yeah, with us. And these guys had all used for at least a year, okay? And the design was that we tested half of them first off when they were intoxicated with their own cannabis, and then a week later when they were sober. And the other group we tested first when they were sober, and then a week later when they were intoxicated with their own cannabis. And we looked at the 3 things that are meant to be the harms of cannabis, so psychosis-like effects, memory, and addiction. And then, because we have a Home Office license in the UK, which my kids think is fantastic, because I can actually possess and supply cannabis legally. So we took a sample of their own cannabis and got it analysed. And we again looked at cannabis in hair, saliva, urine. We looked at their cannabis use, and we also looked at genetic data. 600 isn't enough for genetic analysis yet, but we're building it up. Okay, so memory function. We looked at their memory first when they were not intoxicated, when they were sober. We divided them into the red group here, who had no CBD in their cannabis, and the green, who had balanced cannabis, so CBD and THC. They had the same amount of THC. It's only the CBD that differed. So they were fine. When they weren't intoxicated, they were the same. When they were intoxicated, those guys who didn't have CBD in their cannabis were much worse. The guys who had CBD in their cannabis, it didn't make any difference. They performed as well under their cannabis as they did under when they were sober. Okay? So this was showing that CBD protects you against the memory-impairing effects of THC. And again, we think we know why in terms of the mechanism of effect. And then we looked at something called an attentional bias, which is a measure we use to look at how addicted people are to a drug. Just to try and explain what happens. If you're addicted to a drug or you're a very heavy user, your eyes go straight towards it. So if you're walking down Pusher Street, your eyes will go towards the thing that you're interested in. So that when someone is a heavy user or an addict, cues associated with the drug, so for heroin users, needles and whatever, for cannabis users, maybe a pipe or a spliff or a joint, they grab the user's attention. We can even measure it. We do it in the labs. We measure where people move their eyes when they're looking at drug-related pictures or not. And this attentional bias increases the person's drug craving, and it predicts levels of addiction. So now maybe you can join in with this one. I'll just show you an example of a task. It's really easy. All you have to do is look at some pictures and count the number of lines. Okay? So there could be 2 lines, 3 lines, or 4 lines. That's all you have to do, just try and count the lines. Right. Hope this will work. Okay. Did you get all those? Yeah, hands up who got them all right. Ah, you're a good lot. You're good. Okay. Did you notice anything about the lines? Well, some of the lines, I'm sure you did notice, some of the lines were behind neutral pictures, so like paper clips or whatever. And when we looked at how people performed in this task, there was no difference between people who had no CBD in their cannabis and people with CBD. They were exactly the same to these neutral pictures. But then when we looked at how they performed when counting the lines that were behind cannabis-related pictures, all things to do with food, because you all know you all know that one of the side effects of cannabis is to give you the munchies. You want to eat. And so what we found was very significant differences. So the people whose cannabis had no CBD in it performed much worse than those with CBD. In fact, the CBD were that's the difference between how fast they responded to neutral pictures and cannabis pictures. And the CBD cannabis people were fine. And the same with the food. So if your cannabis had no THC in, you were much more drawn to the food pictures than to the neutral pictures. This didn't happen with CBD. And this is the main reason, when we found this, that people are now looking at CBD as a potential cure for obesity, because it takes you away from the food stimuli. So there are now clinical trials going on for CBD as a treatment. But also, if you look at those who preferred cannabis with high THC and no or hardly any CBD, in that 600 young people, those who preferred that type of cannabis were significantly more addicted on clinical criteria. They smoked 3.5 grams, which is the normal amount you buy in the UK, much faster. They craved cannabis when they were sober more than those who had CBD in their cannabis. And they had more THC and less, if any, CBD in their hair. But interestingly, when we looked at how stoned they got, CBD didn't affect that. So it's kind of strange that these people are smoking stuff with no CBD, because there's no more pleasure in it, just the higher levels of THC. If the levels of THC are the same, having the CBD doesn't make you less stoned. So by smoking that kind of cannabis, they're getting no more pleasure, but they're experiencing more harms. So how does cannabis act on the brain? I'm going to tell you a quick little story. There's a very nice chap who's only about this big called Raphael Meshulam, an Israeli, and he asked the Israeli police to give him 5 kilograms of cannabis This was about 15 years ago. It was completely illegal what he did. They shouldn't have given him the cannabis. But he took it away, and 2 years later, he discovered THC and CBD. And since then, he's discovered many, many other cannabinoids in cannabis. But after that discovery, Howlett, an American woman, then discovered cannabinoid receptors. So CB1 receptors, which are mostly in the brain and the nervous system, CB2 receptors that are mostly in our immune systems and are implicated in cancer. And it's interesting, people always say to me, but why do we have cannabis receptors even if we don't smoke cannabis? Isn't it weird that our brains contain something specifically for cannabis? And even if you go back in evolution, you can find evidence that sea creatures have cannabis receptors in their brains. But are these receptors there to help us get stoned? Or, as one of my students once suggested, were they put there by the secret police so they could identify cannabis users and arrest them? The answer is neither. The answer is if we've got receptors in our brains for particular chemicals, then it means that our brains naturally have that chemical in their brain. It's there normally. Okay, so there must be an endogenous, naturally occurring cannabis in the brain. It took them another 10 years to find it. And again, it was Raphael's team. And they discovered the brain's own cannabis. And the first one they discovered, they called Anandamide, a very important chemical. And bless his heart, Raphael Mashulam decided to call it Anandamide, because seriously, he's not that against cannabis. Ananda is the Sanskrit word for bliss and delight. So anandamide means the bliss or the delight chemical in the brain. And after Raphael discovered anandamide, his PhD student Ben Shabbat went on to discover another one with a ridiculously long name, which has just been shortened to 2-AG. So the brain has its own natural cannabis, which must play an important part in something, otherwise it wouldn't be there. So there are really 3 types now of cannabinoids that we're working with. There are endocannabinoids, so they're endogenous cannabinoids, and they're naturally in the brain, in all our brains. And then the phytocannabinoids are natural to the plant. And now increasingly, as medical research has got involved, there are synthetic cannabinoids. So given you can work out the formula of the cannabinoids in the plant. Some of them you can actually synthesize chemically. But it doesn't matter where they're coming from. All of them act on CB1 and CB2 receptors. And we now know that these receptors play an important part, mainly from animal research, but also some human research. They're very important in the pleasure-pain pathways in the brain. They're important in addiction. They're hugely important in appetite, as you'd imagine, and memory, mental health, and importantly, the immune system. But that's the receptors, but how does cannabis use affect the brain? Well, like most drugs that people enjoy taking, cannabis acts on a part of the brain which is the brain's natural reward pathway. And it goes from subcortical areas, called the nucleus accumbens, ventral tegmental area, right through to the prefrontal areas here, which were the last to develop in evolution. And most things we like act on this pathway. So the rewarding effects of sex as well as drugs operate on that pathway. And a particularly important part of that pathway is this bit here called the striatum, which is like a reward or pleasure center in the brain. And importantly, a chemical called dopamine is the brain's reward chemical. And you can see here the striatum. Now, this is a study we did where we took cannabis users and people who didn't use, and we injected them with a radio labeled, it's like a radioactive material, which goes into the brain and it lights up the dopamine areas. And what this study showed, these pictures of the brain are cannabis users' brains minus healthy brains. So the difference occurred in these areas, again, in the pleasure center of the striatum. And dopamine acting in the striatum produces pleasure. And so if we look at particularly the area, how the area produces the pleasure chemical dopamine, the people who fulfilled criteria for clinical addiction to cannabis had the least. Those who used cannabis but weren't addicted had more, and people who didn't use at all had the most. And trying to see how that was related to their actual use of cannabis, we found that effect here correlated or was associated with the time taken to smoke 3.5 grams. So that showed this brain effect was related to the speed at which someone consumed their cannabis. And the other thing we found it related to, can you see these graphs here? Yeah. No. Okay. The other thing it related to was the age of first cannabis use. So the younger you were, here we're looking at 13-year-olds, when you started using cannabis, the lower this level of dopamine synthesis. So again, showing there is a vulnerable period, especially between 10 and 14 years, when it's not a good idea to smoke cannabis. So that's how it affects the reward pathways and dopamine in the brain. But how does cannabis use affect the brain's natural cannabis, its endocannabinoid system? Well, you can look at that because your brain kind of floats in a thing called cerebrospinal fluid and has lots of holes in areas where it's just filled with fluid. And the fluid also goes down your spine. And if you can take a sample of this fluid from the bottom of the spine, it's called a lumbar puncture. And so it's CSF, cerebral spinal fluid. It's like the brain's bathwater, if you like. And in that, we get a very good measure of endocannabinoids in the brain itself. And we looked at anandamide, the main natural cannabinoid, and what we found was that in heavy users of cannabis, the level of anandamide, your natural cannabis, had gone down compared to other people who had low levels of use of cannabis or no levels of use. And this is where we want to start with the medicine, because the endocannabinoid system is also altered in people with schizophrenia. So in people with schizophrenia, those who have a high level of anandamide in their brains have less schizophrenic symptoms. And the more schizophrenics smoke cannabis, and lots of them do, the lower again their levels of anandamide. Now we know that CBD actually inhibits the breakdown of anandamide in your brain. It's again a reason not to smoke cannabis without CBD. So then the natural question becomes, well, can giving people CBD, can it boost their levels of anandamide and therefore help treat schizophrenia? A colleague of ours who we work with in Mannheim in Germany, Markus Leverker, did this study. And what he did was take 50% of a group of schizophrenics and gave them CBD every day for 4 weeks. And he compared them with 50% of schizophrenics that were given a standard drug treatment for schizophrenia called amisulpride, again every day for 4 weeks. And in terms of the reduction in psychotic symptoms, there was no difference at all. CBD was just as good as a traditional anti-schizophrenic drug, which was an amazing finding. And when he looked at anandamide, he couldn't do it in the brain because it's doing that procedure with schizophrenics is very distressing. So he just looked at it in blood. And he found that treatment with CBD increased anandamide in the blood of schizophrenics, and that related to their improvement. I don't know if you know any people with schizophrenia, but one of the most heartbreaking things when a young person is diagnosed is that they're automatically given a drug. And on that standard drug, all of those, over 100 drugs available, they all mean you put on at least 1 kilogram a week. And if you're a young adolescent, that's awful, because in a year, you've put on massive amounts of weight. But, and partly because CBD is good at suppressing appetite, it's good at stopping your eyes going towards food, the people given the standard treatment gained 4 kilograms over those 4 weeks. The people given CBD didn't put on any weight. So, to summarize this a little bit, THC and CBD are a bit like a yin and yang. THC induces anxiety, CBD reduces it. THC produces psychotic-like symptoms. CBD has antipsychotic effects. THC impairs memory and learning, and CBD can enhance it and block the memory-impairing effects of THC. So that's kind of one aspect now that people are very excited about. Marcus Leviker's study is only one that's been done to date. There's another one going on at Yale at the moment. We need to make sure these results are robust, so before anything can be used as a proper treatment. But cannabinoids have been used in medicine for a while. In the 1980s, THC, synthetic THC, was used for nausea with radiotherapy, and also to stimulate appetite in late-stage AIDS. It's now, I think even in Denmark in 2011, a mixture of THC and CBD was approved for people with multiple sclerosis, and it's now available widely as a treatment throughout the world. Since 2010, there's been a huge amount of research trials looking at cannabinoids in schizophrenia, in anxiety, cancer, glaucoma, obesity, and epilepsy. And interestingly, CBD has been shown to help childhood epilepsy that doesn't respond to other treatments. And there's a big trial just started in America now of CBD and epilepsy. The cannabis plant, is it therefore going to be a treasure trove of important medicines? Well, given there are over 100 cannabinoids in the plant, and if you just imagine the research in CBD is just the beginning, there are 98 others that could have potential medical effects. Medical marijuana is now become widely available, so rather than the cannabinoids, the whole plant being available. And all these countries now allow medical marijuana. And the main symptoms, if you look, we work in one in California, a big clinic, the main symptoms that medical marijuana is prescribed for are pain, anxiety, sleep problems, and occasionally, which I love, a new diagnosis, a psychiatric diagnosis. Yeah, you didn't think you had a mental disorder. Well, if you ever experience writer's block in California, that's a disorder. And now in both Washington State and Colorado, you can use marijuana recreationally as well as medically. And Colorado's gone completely over the top. They're selling medicinal THC, so high levels of THC, and they're selling them in truffles, in chocolate cookies, all the things that kids would just love. What a clever idea is that, to try and stop young teenagers using when their brain's developing. And they're selling it like sweets. Washington State's been much more balanced about it, but Colorado's been stupid, actually. So they've got, look at it, it's like a sweet shop. So that will probably, and also they've paid no attention to CBD in any of the medical marijuana stores or the recreational stores. So they're just pushing THC, which has got to be a bad idea. one of the kind of issues is what's happened. Why was it that cannabis, up to say 10 years ago, it wasn't an issue? There was lots of CBD around, and suddenly it's gone. What does that mean? 5 minutes, okay. Where has all the... It's much nicer than people putting up a big thing saying, shut up. Where has all the CBD gone? Well, I'm sure it's different here in Christiania, but in the UK, what's happening now is that the vast majority of marijuana is grown intensively in illegal farms. And these farms basically grow the marijuana in hydroponic solution, very, very potent, and they grow it under 24-hour lighting, which must have an effect. You see, if we look over from 2002, 2008, the amount of police seizures that had no CBD in went from 30% in 2002 to 80% in 2008. So it's been for years now, 80% of the UK market is cannabis with no CBD in it. So we went to visit a botanist at the only legal cannabis farm in the UK. This is me and my team. Because he was doing an experiment growing cannabis there, like people do illegally in these farms. And he showed that 24-hour lighting destroys CBD in the trichomes at the end of the flowers. So basically, the way it's grown, mostly by Vietnamese and Chinese immigrants in the UK, has destroyed the CBD. And that's what's caused the major problems with addiction, probably in other parts of Europe as well. But finally, just to consider quickly what implications our scientific understanding of cannabis have for debates about legalization. Well, for a start, if cannabis wasn't illegal, then control of the market would allow rich CBD forms to be sold and get rid of this stuff that's harming mental health of young people. This would help protect the young people from mental health harms. We could have controlled sales to stop it being sold to people under 16 at least. A big problem in this area is the penalties for using the drug are often more damaging than the drug itself. If you look, this is the American prison population since 1971, when Richard Nixon declared war on drugs. Basically, the prison population in many countries, in the UK, we have a third of the people in prison are there with drug problems. So we're putting people in, if you're a young person, you use cannabis, okay, might have some harms, but having a prison record is much more harming for your life than the drug could ever be. Spending to fight the drug war, the war on drugs, has just gone up exponentially in the States, and now South America is saying, enough, we don't want you to destroy the plants we're growing. There are other non-scientific reasons. The London School of Economics recently did an analysis of what would happen if you made cannabis legal in the UK, and the balance is taking into account fewer people in prison, more tax revenues from sales, that actually it would benefit the economy hugely and may help us out of the recession. In Uruguay, in April this year, it will be legal. It's the only country in the world where it will be legal to actually produce as well as consume cannabis. And individuals can also grow 6 plants for their own use. There's a kind of lots of information on the web saying surely it's time Uruguay was given the Nobel Peace Prize, given the amount of violence that's associated with the drug gangs dealing with cannabis there. In conclusion, pleasure, yes. Medicine, yes. Madness in those who are vulnerable generally for other reasons, and addiction certainly in people who are using cannabis without CBD. I think overall, we know that all drugs have side effects, but in the case of cannabis, These also include political side effects that we have to deal with. That's the team. Thank you very much.